Hi, everybody. It's our pleasure to join again with our good friend Jacob Magid of the Times of Israel. And Jacob, take it we're finding you in your home, and you're just a few hours away from flying off to Doha. And of course, isn't everybody flying off to Doha right about now? Um, so maybe we'll start with why are you going to Doha? What are you hoping to accomplish there? What are you covering for the Times of Israel? And then we'll get into some of the other things going on.
Sure. I guess I'm just trying to get out of this weather, but because I think it's supposed
Yeah.
to be 80 degrees there, which will be nice if I go outside at all. I'm going to be attending what's called the Doha Forum, which is a gathering that the Qatari government is hosting for foreign officials and business leaders from around the world. A lot of countries try to host these gatherings. If you think of, there's one called the Munich Security Conference is one that comes to mind. There's a couple in Aspen in Colorado. I've been to ones in the UAE. Israel tries to host. It's a little bit trickier in terms of getting regional allies to come to these, but there are actually there aren't Israeli officials going to this, but there are some Israeli business leaders who are going, former government officials, a couple of them as well. And I think former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was supposed to go. I saw his name dropped from the list, so I don't think he'll be there. But it's kind of just an opportunity to have all these people in one room and for trying to gain sources. It's a really beneficial opportunity. It's definitely a lot of travel just for that, but it's not so often you get all these people from different countries in the same room, and you try to pull them aside and get them to speak with you. It's not always easy being working for an Israeli publication, but you try to kind of demonstrate your credentials, maybe go through other people, and over time, kind of that at least you're building the foundation there. And if it doesn't lead to necessarily an interview on the spot, then hopefully in the next time when something happens, I can call some of these people if I got a business card, and maybe they'll be more willing to speak with me, having now seen my face at least.
So what's on the agenda?
There are different panels about regional issues. So there's definitely a bunch of panels on Gaza, some on Ukraine as well, and the Ukraine-Russia war, general regional cooperation. But really, I think the more interesting stuff really happens on the sidelines. Not so many people. Even when I go into some of the sessions, there aren't even that many people there. It's more, I think, kind of the smaller sessions that aren't so publicized, so it's hard to get into those. And that's what I'm kind of working on today is trying to get some invites to them. But yeah, I think sometimes there are things that are on the record and publicized that some of those sessions that if there's a major world leader, like I think the Qatari prime minister is supposed to be speaking at one of the sessions. So it's possible. Usually anytime a world leader speaks on Gaza, for us, it's news. So I'm
Mhm.
sure I'll be covering that. But beyond that, I'm not so sure.
And which Israelis get invited, and how do you get it? How would they even choose the Israelis that are?
Yeah, I guess I think it has to do with just how well they're connected with the government. I think those who are more critical of Qatar are probably less likely to be invited. With journalists, I think maybe has to do with just their familiarity with your work because I've covered um, the Gaza hostage talks for a while and have some sources in Qatar. I guess they're willing to invite me. And in terms of business leaders, also, I think people who have been willing to do work in Qatar, and there are quite a few, including some who are connected to the government, some who used to be in government and now moved into kind of, I don't know, defense sales or AI work or security finance, security technology that end up having ties with Doha in some fashion. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Would you say that, from your view, that now that there is a ceasefire, that Israelis are being more accepted in the larger world in these kinds of forums? I mean, we hear about defense contracts with Germany, for instance. So, as much as Israel might be criticized around the world, there's still business being done, and Israel's economy is going forward. Do you find that to be true in a place like Doha?
Yeah, I think Qatar is a little bit more sensitive because of, I think, first of all, it's a very complicated country to say the least. And therefore, I think especially after the war and the feeling amongst a lot of Israelis that while Qatar maybe sometimes played a productive role in the hostage negotiations, they're also seen as someone who backs Hamas, given that they host their leaders there. It was at the U.S. and Israeli request before the war. Maybe things
Hmm.
will change afterwards, but it's a complicated relationship, and they seem to back and fund a lot of projects and initiatives that Israel is less comfortable with and more critical of Israel, specifically like Al Jazeera, the media outlet. But to your question, I do think it helps for sure that the war is over. I think it like just an hour, less than an hour ago, the Eurovision organizers that the
Right.
song
I saw that.
contest in that's going to be taking place. I forgot where in Europe this year. Um, will be will be allowing Israel to participate. There have been some pushes from countries not to allow an Israeli contestant. And ultimately, after the decision was made, I think it was the Netherlands, Spain, and Ireland who announced that they would not be participating in the contest because Israel was going to be also allowed. So I guess you could say, look, the war ended and now Israel is able to participate, but clearly there's still a lot of negative feelings towards Israel at the moment. I think that will kind of settle. It's at the end of the day, a lot of the world is kind of more judged by interests as opposed to ideals. If you think about what comes to mind just off the top of my head is when President Biden was running for election, he called Saudi Arabia a pariah state,
Yeah.
and had a very poor relationship with them coming out of the gate when he won. But he quickly shifted when he realized the importance that Saudi Arabia plays in the broader region and the benefits he could have politically at the domestic level, to help maybe normalizing, helping Israel and Saudi Arabia normalize relations, and also just the benefit of having Saudi Arabia help on various other conflicts that he needed their assistance, like on the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think at the end of the day, if countries feel that their interests are more aligned with Israel, even if maybe their certain parts of their publics are not so comfortable with it, that oftentimes wins the day.
Although I think you could make the argument that there's a entire industry involved with criticizing Israel in the press and everywhere else, that other countries may not be suffering with. And it's a very organized effort around the world. But I don't think that all of our listeners today are aware of how important Eurovision is for Israelis. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I would definitely say I didn't really pay attention to it before I lived in Israel for a few years. And I was there when Netta Barzilai won in 2020, something like that, around COVID, maybe before or after. But yes, it's something that it's kind of like, maybe this is exaggerating, but it's kind of like the Super Bowl for a lot of Israelis. In America, it's kind of more seen as something that's more that people in the LGBT community are often following because there is a very much a pride element to a lot of the performances, and kind of being comfortable in your own skin. And there's a lot of wacky performances as well. And still, I think Israelis take it seriously. I think they like first of all, I think it's important because they see that they are a part of the the region. It's not the regional, but it's because they're not accepted in necessarily the region, at least until recently, at a greater scale with the Abraham Accords, being able to participate with other countries like any other country in Europe is something that I think they really appreciate and take very seriously. The voting, I think, in Israel is at much higher levels than a lot of other countries. And while not everyone is very interested necessarily in the singing, and the songs aren't necessarily the highest quality, the lyrics are oftentimes bizarre. I think it's something that brings Israelis together, and it's oftentimes a real respite, I think, from like the intensity of life in Israel, particularly over the past few years. I think there was a lot of pride that despite Israel not winning any of these past 2 years, I think getting very, very close, and actually winning the popular vote, which I think was a real boost for Israelis feeling that like they're isolated from the world. I just think it really does play a really important role, not just in the field of music, but beyond.
Right. It's that sense of being normalized on a level and I think probably much more than any other country I can think of in the Middle East, Israelis want to be seen as being more Western than Middle Eastern. And
Yeah,
that
I
has to do
think
with
that
the diaspora, it has to do with a lot of things. So I don't think we can really, I don't think we can really overestimate how important it is for Israelis to be accepted in Eurovision. It's a what is it? It's a pop. It's like The Voice for Europe, right? And without the
mhm.
chairs. And but for Israelis, it's very important. Just and I wonder what the impact in Israel is when you see all of these artists, including Paul Simon, sign off on a demand to release Barghouti from jail. So maybe you could talk for a minute about who Barghouti is and why this is even coming up.
Sure. I think so. Marwan Barghouti is a prominent Palestinian leader, specifically within the Fatah movement, which is what's currently headed by Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. He came up in the 80s and a little bit before, and then during the Second Intifada was involved in, or allegedly, no, he was convicted of carrying out attacks or directing attacks during the Second Intifada that killed 5 people. But he's a complex figure. He's also come out in favor of the peace process with Israel during the Oslo Accords, which is just right around that, and got disillusioned by the fact that there wasn't enough progress. He felt that Israel wasn't holding to its commitments in the Oslo Accords to further withdraw from the West Bank, and therefore felt that attacks on Israeli settlers or soldiers in the West Bank was legitimate. Actually, what he was convicted for was not that. He disputes what he was convicted for. He says that a lot of the evidence was shielded and classified, and that the people who Israel relied on to convict him actually recanted in their trial testimony, and would say that actually they were tortured to confess and blame Barghouti for having allegedly directed them. So that's what he says about his trial, but he was definitely convicted, and it was a very high profile case. And the reason why he's comes up every so years is because whenever there's a hostage deal, his name is always at the top of the list for who Hamas or the PA have tried to get released, because he's seen as someone who's very, very popular. Partially because President Abbas is seen as someone who's very unpopular. He's polling very poorly. I think 80 to 85% of Palestinians want him to resign. He's been there for a long time and hasn't held elections. But if the elections were held, polls show that Marwan Barghouti would actually win, despite having been in prison for all these years. He's even been put in solitary confinement, and family says, since October 7th. So every war, so there's talk of getting him released. Israel's pretty adamant, I think, possibly because they see him as such a popular figure and maybe aren't so comfortable with his more hardline positions than Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, regarding when violence he sees as legitimate and when it's not. And as a result, I think there was a push this again it started to be from actually international figures. And I actually reported a little bit about it a few weeks ago that the push actually included the Trump administration as well, that they feel like he's someone that could be a real game changer for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, arguing that he has this unique ability to unify Palestinians. And while we might think it's unifying them toward something that's a little bit more hardline than what we're comfortable with, we think it's malleable and that maybe he can be moved a little bit more. And B, that unity is so important because what's been such a obstacle to trying to get any sort of peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians is that there's two factions, and that amongst the Palestinians, that they're not unified. And if we can get one leader who's able to unify them and agree to at least hold negotiations with Israel, that's a real beneficial step. But I think Netanyahu and the government is not anywhere near in a position where they're open to doing this. And as a result, I think it's going to be a lot of pushing from the Trump administration if they do decide to take this route. I think there are some in the administration who are very senior, who are open to this, but I think it'll be ultimately decision by Trump himself, who actually has mentioned he's considering it, but hasn't really spoken out about it since.
But isn't it also possible that because Barghouti, I mean, even Hamas was arguing to get Barghouti out. Or they wanted that, they wanted to get credit for that. And so, isn't it possible that there are those in the Netanyahu coalition that are totally committed to keeping Barghouti in jail just as a safeguard against a Palestinian state? Because he may be the
Yes,
one leader who could do that.
exactly. I think it was interesting to hear Ron Lauder, who's the head of the World Jewish Congress, actually was also advocating behind the scenes as someone. So these aren't necessarily doves or very far leftists who recognize Barghouti's appeal. On the other hand, his comments regarding legitimizing attacks on Israeli settlers who are also still civilians at the end of the day are probably understandably very difficult for Israelis to accept and want to legitimize. And I think the longer he's been in jail, just as he's been elevated in Palestinian society, I think he's also been demonized, or rightfully so, arguably, in Israeli society, and framed as this mega terrorist. So the more that he isn't released over time, the harder it becomes to release him later, because he's just seen as such an important figure, and it becomes more of a concession for Israel to make to agree to release him. So I think it's a really hard sell. That I don't think I see this government, and honestly, I'm not sure any government agreeing to at this point.
Well, I think it's a commonly held belief again by I would think even the majority of Israelis that Barghouti has Israeli blood on his hands. I mean, and so the fact that there's a push in the outside world to have him released is read by many Israelis, I think, as saying, well, you don't care about Jewish blood. And
Right,
it's not really focusing on whether or not he's actually guilty of the crimes that he's being charged with.
right. And I think there's this attempt to frame him as a Palestinian Nelson Mandela. And
Yes.
his when I interviewed his wife, she talked about how, people called Mandela a terrorist as well before he was released, and then they ran to shake his hand afterwards. Obviously, Israelis would push back to that narrative because Mandela wasn't accused or convicted of the things that Barghouti was. But that's definitely the framing you're hearing more and more in the international community. And then, as you mentioned, some of these cultural icons and other famous actors, Hollywood and elsewhere, are latching onto it.
Did you get much pushback for that interview you did with his wife?
There were a couple, I think, people who reached out who felt that we were normalizing Barghouti or legitimizing him. Yes, but actually, it was interesting to hear feedback from government officials who felt it was important that we at least, yes, platform at this time, given the fact that the U.S. is actually interested in this issue. I wouldn't have done the story had there not been actually efforts behind the scenes to try to get him released. And because those efforts are taking place, I wanted to report on them, but also, therefore, give people the space to understand why they're taking place, and have an understanding of who this person is.
So if you were a betting man, would you bet that Barghouti is going to get out of jail in the next year?
No, I would not. Definitely not. But I don't think it's impossible.
Hmm.
And that might have been different. I wouldn't have responded even that um, favorably towards him before the war.
So speaking about impossible issues, your last piece in the Times of Israel has the heading, Trump says next phase of his Gaza plan will soon commence amid concern it's stalling. So where are we with this plan? Do you think that Barghouti will get out before this Trump plan is implemented?
Oh, no, I think my understanding is the Trump administration was looking at the idea, trying to get this plan kind of the Gaza ceasefire stabilized, getting all the hostages, the remains of all hostages out, and now we're down to just one last hostage, the body of Ran Gvili, who is still in Gaza. But it's pretty remarkable that we're even at this place where it's just one person left at this point. And getting those hostages out, getting the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, stood up, and just kind of calming the situation in Gaza, maybe getting some of the reconstruction started, and then that backdrop, then maybe come to Israel again and start pushing them to release Barghouti. That was the way one senior U.S. official explained how they were looking at it. But Trump saying that we're at phase two or it's very soon, I think my understanding is they are trying to make an announcement soon about something regarding the implementation of phase two. I think it could be another week or so. That's why I spoke with one U.S. official today who tried to kind of downplay speculation that things are going not very well. Because if you recall, just over 2 weeks ago, there was a UN Security Council resolution that was passed, basically trying to advance the Trump plan by giving an international mandate to this board of peace that is created in the Trump plan that will be in charge of overseeing and managing Gaza over the next 2 years. And with it, you'll have this ISF, the International Stabilization Force. And the Trump administration argued that the only way to get these programs off the ground was to have an international mandate for them. So they went to the Security Council with this resolution, got it approved, and now they're able to move forward. But there hasn't been any announcement of any countries actually joining this stabilization force that's going to be in charge of securing Gaza, theoretically in charge of helping disarm Hamas, and also just taking part in the governing and stabilization of the Strip. In this board of peace as well, he talked about there are all these lots of countries that are interested in sending their leaders to be part of the board with Trump, but we haven't had any announcements. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot of apprehension about, on the ISF side, contributing troops to this force and then finding yourself in the middle between Israel on one side and Hamas on the other side. And that's not a real safe place to be, understandably. And as a result, especially given that Hamas is not really interested in disarming, as a result, I think we haven't had, despite there's talk of Indonesia and Azerbaijan sending troops, they haven't formally made any announcements yet. Now, President Trump is saying that soon they're going to be doing so. There's going to be some phase two related announcement regarding some of these mechanisms, but that hasn't happened yet. And I think it has to do with a lot of that apprehension. Part of it has to do, I think, also with Israel's pushback on having Turkey be part of this ISF. President Erdogan is incredibly critical of Israel, accuses them of committing genocide in Gaza, and compares Israel to the Nazis. So this is someone who's soured very quickly. He's kind of like a yo-yo in his relationship with Israel over the past decade or so, because things were warming up under the previous government. But Israel understandably doesn't want Turkey involved. On the other hand, countries feel that Turkey provides this insurance policy because they are a guarantor of this deal, because they're another Islamic majority country, a very prominent one in the region, and because they're less likely, therefore, these other countries feel that to have their troops shot at by Hamas forces, because Hamas might be more careful to shoot at forces either that include Turkish troops or are affiliated with Turkish troops. So they want Turkey to be part of this force, and Israel doesn't. And because Israel's vetoed for now, and the U.S. is not pushing Israel to reverse that veto, that therefore some of the countries are also staying on the sidelines, which the U.S. would like to see take part in this program. So there's a lot of hiccups getting thing off the ground. And the last thing that I'll just mention regarding that is on the issue of reconstruction. And there's this push by the U.S. to try to at least start some of it. They don't want to do it on the Hamas side of the Hamas half of the Strip. So what happened during the ceasefire is you had an Israeli withdrawal to basically half of the Strip is a rectangle. And if you divide it vertically by two, Israel basically withdrew towards its own border, but still kept 50% control of 50% of the Strip on its side. And the idea was the U.S. wanted to have the reconstruction of Gaza at least start on that Israeli side, because then you don't have Hamas trying to play spoiler there. But on the one hand, you have Israel that's not happy about that idea. They don't want construction close to its borders, one. On others, they don't want reconstruction while there still haven't been bodies or one body returned. And they're adamant about that, not reconstruction not happening until that happens. And on the other hand, you have countries that are considered potential donors not being interested in actually giving money to that kind of project because they fear that it'll end up just ingraining the status quo. And you'll have a situation where only 50% of Gaza is theoretically rebuilt, and then another 50% is left in shambles. And all the people are actually in that other 50% on the Hamas side because they're uncomfortable going to back under an Israeli controlled or an Israeli cooperated side that's maybe run by the ISF. So there are a lot of difficult questions that haven't been resolved yet. I guess Trump is hoping to do so in the next week or so. But it's going to be a very heavy lift. I think as hard as it is to imagine, this is the harder part as opposed to actually getting the ceasefire, which seemed impossible just weeks before.
Right. So anything's possible, but the fact that Yasser Abu Shabab, a leader of one of these militias, was killed by Hamas is also a statement, isn't it? It's a statement to anybody who wants to get involved. And clearly, I think the timing is pretty clear that Hamas wants to make that statement to the United States and anybody else who would deign to come in there.
That's very much a possibility. I spoke with an Israeli official. They haven't. There's not a clear reason why he was killed yet. There's also indications, according to one Israeli official I spoke with, that this is something that was done actually due to internal strife, internal battles within Palestinians that actually didn't have to do with Hamas, given that Yasser Abu Shabab is currently located on the Israeli side of the Yellow Line. But this is someone who is a very controversial figure, who's basically a drug lord before the war that Israel kind of used as found common interest in going after Hamas because he didn't like Hamas either. But this wasn't a good person, Lamed Vavnik, I would say, by any means. And as a result, he had lots of enemies, not just in Hamas, but possibly amongst his own people, amongst his own clan, or maybe in rival clans who were nearby. It is possible that this was the act of Hamas, and that wouldn't be surprising by any means. But the initial understanding amongst the Israeli security establishment is that he was actually killed by other rival clans in Gaza, or members of other rival clans in Gaza. I think it's just the idea to push this Abu Shabab clan during the war as a counter to Hamas was done because Israel doesn't want to use the Palestinian Authority. And I think this effort to try to rely on these very small clans
Yeah.
instead of a much more, well, with all of its problems, and we can get into it, much more established government at a much more widespread level, because these clans are only able to control very small parts of the strip where they're located. These aren't like formalized governments. But this was the approach that Israel took throughout the war, rather than rely on the PA, was to try to find clans that would do their dirty work for them.
Right. In the meantime, the PA has won its way back into the good graces of the Trump administration by firing one of its ministers over the payment, the pay for slay um, issues. So I have the sense that the United States is playing chess on a whole variety of different levels with Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I'm hoping you can help us unpack that just a little bit, because you have the United States lifting sanctions now um, of the PA with the firing of a minister who they're using as the scapegoat for this whole pay for slay thing. And at the same time, the President Trump is giving full-throated support to Prime Minister Netanyahu's efforts to exonerate himself and find a pardon, and putting a lot of pressure on President Herzog. So, is this the United States' way of giving Bibi something that he wants so that they can come back with putting the PA in power? There's a lot of pieces here. Help us understand that a little bit more, because it gives me a headache just to think about it.
Yeah, I don't know if there's some grand strategy here. I think that's the assumption. And when I spoke with U.S. officials about Trump's decision to weigh in on this issue of Bibi and getting a pardon, they were adamant that this is just like a one-time kind of being done in a vacuum almost, because Trump feels he sees what is happening to Netanyahu as similar to what he underwent, and similarly feels that both of these cases are over nothing, that they're being attacked by the deep state, and therefore Trump has a very easy time sympathizing and connecting with Netanyahu's situation. I think Netanyahu's allies like Mark Levin, the Fox News commentator, have been a very good job at framing and getting in Trump's ear about talking about this case in a very dismissive way. And so Trump is connected with that and has had no issue with speaking out on Netanyahu's behalf. But I think also at the same time that it wasn't there. So on the one hand, it wasn't like, okay, we're doing this so in order that people will give us something later. On the other hand, of course, Trump is remembering when he comes to Bibi later on, if he's asking him for certain things, I'm sure this will come up, or other things that he's done for Israel. He likes to talk about the pulling out of the Iran deal or moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and those kinds of steps that he took during his first term, and the Abraham Accords, of course. But is it part of a broader scheme? I think they're kind of taking things one day at a time. And one of the reasons I think that is that there's so many issues that the Trump administration is trying to deal with at once. and they keep using the same people, namely Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the region, and Jared Kushner, who's supposed to not be in government but is basically acting as a government official. And they're being tasked with dealing with Russia and the Ukraine war there, at the same time as trying to stabilize the ceasefire in Gaza. And those are two issues that you need more than a full-time job to do. And I think one of the reasons that we've kind of gotten stuck at times is because they have been busy dealing with so many issues at once, and they aren't able to fully focus on this Gaza ceasefire implementation. Regarding the pardon, the other thing I was also told is that Trump feels that he's done all he can. He sent a letter to President Herzog urging for the pardoning of Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is something I think that Herzog would like to see happen. I think it's been something he's kind of been working on quietly behind the scenes. He has certain terms that Netanyahu is not prepared to accept, so I don't know if that will blow up the whole process. But there was a call earlier this week between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, my understanding, raised this issue again. Maybe you can do more. Maybe you can,
Yeah,
like
right,
Netanyahu's allies have even talked about the U.S. maybe sanctioning members of the Israeli judiciary that are involved in the case against Netanyahu. Maybe that's what Netanyahu is referring to when he's urging Trump to do more. I don't think that's where the U.S. is right now. I think they're actually quite frustrated with Netanyahu on other fronts, namely on Syria and Lebanon, where they feel that yes, there are forces in those countries that are causing problems, but they feel that Israel's response and its airstrikes in both countries have gone over the line and are threatening to destabilize two countries that the U.S., particularly Syria, is very interested in trying to redevelop, and they have a lot of faith in both, and mainly in President Bashar of Syria, in his ability to reunify the country, and they feel that Netanyahu or Israel has gone too far in its responses to some of the clashes that have been taking there, and they are starting to believe some of the criticisms that other countries in the region, be it Syria, Lebanon, but also the UAE, has been making this comment behind closed doors, and Saudi Arabia for sure, even more so, that Israel is actually becoming a destabilizing factor. And they're even comparing it to Iran, which is nuts in a lot of ways. But that's how these countries see it. That all these conflicts aren't able to subside because the Israeli government is too aggressive in its stances and willingness to use its military force. I think obviously Israelis see it completely differently, but that's the argument that's being made to Trump, and I think it is having an impact.
So the argument in Israel is if we're too weak, then we are vulnerable for it to be destroyed. But if we're too strong and we're trying to protect ourselves by holding on to Mount Hermon, and then we're the Goliath of the neighborhood, right? So there's no winning here.
Right.
But it's just kind of going into Lebanon for a minute. Some of the things that I read suggest that the Lebanese government may be overtly critical, but they're sort of cheering on Israel's efforts with Hezbollah, and they're bombing them every day, blowing them up, killing some of their leaders and Hamas leaders as well. Um, how much credence is there to this sort of kind of threading the needle in Lebanon?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there is something to they're both the Lebanese government in many ways is more adversarial to Hezbollah than Israel is. They see on their own people the impact that Hezbollah has had on the country, on the economy, and brought them to this really terrible situation that they're in today. But because they are the ones that have to live with Hezbollah at the end of the day, they're concerned about taking too aggressive of an approach, or Israel taking too aggressive of an approach, because they're seen as when there are also either civilians that are killed or just buildings that are flattened. The government is seen as incapable of protecting its own people on the one hand, and seen as a partner with Israel on the other hand, because as much as people don't like Hezbollah in Lebanon, or a lot of people don't like Hezbollah in Lebanon, they don't necessarily have more warm feelings for Israel as a result of the war. So I think the government's in a very difficult situation where, yes, they would like to see Hezbollah weakened, but not through military means. And the problem is it's not really so possible oftentimes to weaken Hezbollah through non-military means. That there is this new government is a real rare opportunity, and they are making kind of small progress toward disarmament and kicking Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon. but it's just at a pace that's been very slow. And Israel claims that it's at a pace that actually is slower than what the pace is that Hamas is actually rearming. And that's why they're taking such an aggressive stance. I think it also has to do with the lessons of October 7th is not waiting for these tigers
Right.
to kind of explode on you. So as a result, they are acting a lot more aggressively than maybe they would have been before. And I think the Lebanese government feels that it's got to get its bearings first and gain legitimacy within the public. And while yes, the public doesn't like Hezbollah, the more these strikes happen, I think the public is also more willing to entertain what Hezbollah is offering.
I want to come back to the pardon issue because you made it clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu has a tremendous amount to gain from this, especially if he doesn't have to apologize, if he doesn't have to take responsibility for whatever charges have been leveled against him and are being tried in a court of law, or at least are being heard in a court of law. What's in it for President Herzog? Why would he pardon him? I mean, I've heard arguments, by Michael Oren, former Ambassador Oren, and others that, this is never going to end. We're never going to have a unity government in Israel until we can start making these kinds of moves. Um, there was a podcast this morning, kind of the BB derangement syndrome issues were very much on display. Uh, I'm not sure you listen to other podcasts besides the Times of Israel, but there was one with that. I'm interested in how you're understanding this. Can you are you're closer to these things than any of us are. How do you how if you were going to guess what's going through President Herzog's mind right now, well, how would you understand it?
Yeah, I think critics of him would say that he's got some sort of arrangement with Netanyahu, and that Netanyahu put forward a very weak, or Netanyahu backed a very weak candidate for president against Herzog when he ran. There's a Knesset vote, and the woman running against him was a woman named Miriam Peretz, a very popular figure in Israel, but not really anyone with political chops. And that was the kind of the seen as the alternative candidate that was quietly backed by Netanyahu, but ended up getting actually very little support, including from the Likud. And there is talk of what were these side deals that Herzog and Netanyahu had before President Herzog became entered the position. And there's been continuous. Herzog has talked about this issue of a pardon for years now, and has brought it up in some very interesting settings, even having meetings with some of the witnesses in Netanyahu's trial, that have raised the suspicion of Netanyahu critics to say, hey, there's some backdoor dealings going on. But I think the alternative is something more, when you were referencing this issue of unity. I think President Herzog has tried to frame himself as someone who is or he that's his mantra. Is something that he's really taken seriously. I don't know how much success he's had, because he's been president during the judicial overhaul, which was really kind of tore the country apart. He tried to host negotiations in order to reach some sort of compromise on that, but those negotiations didn't go anywhere. And I think maybe that this is his next attempt at trying to kind of calm the waters in Israel by at least putting this issue behind the country. Now, on the one hand, I think it could exacerbate things if Israelis feel that, and particularly Netanyahu's critics feel that he's just being given a free pass. On the other hand, the fact that this is just something that's been going on for so many years, and the court systems is what there's a lot of criticism of the judiciary. What's not really highlighted is just the issue that things just take too long, that they're backlogged, and the fact that this has taken 5 years and it's likely to take many more years plus appeals. It's
Right.
not something that's healthy for the country to have to go through for so long. And that if this is what it takes, then so be it. But to be clear, Herzog, I do not think is talking about simply giving Netanyahu a pardon for nothing. I think he is trying to get Netanyahu to admit some sort of guilt. I think his terms are likely going to have some sort of break from politics, but I think that's kind of artificial because if he has to step down for a little bit of time and he's able to run again in the next election next year, I don't really know how much of a how much that's really going to be something that will be difficult for him to accept. The guilty
Right.
thing, accepting guilt, I think is something that I don't see him agreeing to. It really goes against everything that he's talked about until now in terms of this trial. Um, but I think that my understanding is that there's going to be some sort of decision on this in the coming weeks. It's not going to drag out that long.
Right.
Whether or not that actually means a pardon in a few weeks, probably maybe not, but some sort of decision.
There's also the possibility that some people have tossed out that he might drop the judicial reform issues. Um,
Right, which critics will say is, wow, that's some real stita, what's the
it
word?
was an invented issue that now he's reinventing to drop it, right? So,
But also it's like he's holding the country hostage by saying, "Oh, you don't we get you don't want this judicial reform, so I'll drop it if I get what I want," which is a real problem if that's actually what he's saying he's willing to do, which also demonstrates that he's not so serious about the judicial reforms, that it's all just it's all something that he's willing to give up as long as he can get his pardon. So if you're supportive of the judicial reform, that's a really problematic statement to begin with. And actually, we have Bezalel Smotrich come out and say, no, we're going to be moving forward with the
yeah.
judicial overhaul, no matter what.
So, where are we with the Haredi draft issue?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors on this because there's definitely a lot of negotiations happening, and there's committee votes. It's being put. It's Boaz Bismuth, who's a Likud lawmaker, who's head of the committee of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee that's in charge of advancing this legislation. He put forward a new draft, and he's trying to get it through. It's very, very, very unpopular. Um, and across the board, from the only people that seem to support it, even parts of the Haredi lawmakers don't even support it because they feel like it still allows for too many people to join the army. They fear that that will lead to them losing their Torah lifestyle, their ultra orthodox lifestyles. But even the fact that you have some who are willing to accept this legislation demonstrates that there is some credence to the argument that this is
Right.
really not a very serious efforts to try to enlist and share the burden, given that so many people in Israel are serving hundreds of days of service, and we're passing legislation that's really giving blanket exemptions that even the Haredim are willing to get behind. But my understanding is that this is a process that's going to drag out. I don't see it actually passing, and I see it because there's elections in the next year. I don't see there being any interest, as far as Netanyahu goes, in passing legislation that's really his biggest vulnerability in the election, because of this is not something that's just opposed by the left, but also the right, possibly even more so, especially amongst the
Right.
national religious camp in Israel, who serve in the reserves at very high percentages. The idea that we're giving these blanket exemptions to their fellow Orthodox brethren is something that they're no longer willing to accept, especially after October 7th.
Absolutely.
Um, so I think at the end of the day, I have a hard time seeing Netanyahu actually moving forward with this, allowing this legislation to move forward. And I feel like a lot of this is just noise to maybe distract from his trial, to distract from various other issues, which that's kind of the assumption, right, or my assumption right now. To pass it, I think he really exposes himself to massive criticism in the coming elections. And what he's going to have to do to buy time in the meantime is still um, he was supposed to give a speech a couple days ago where he was going to be backing the legislation, at least in theory. And I think that's going to be also a very difficult dance for him to play, where he's going to be going on record talking about why this legislation is important. But then, so even if it doesn't pass, he'll still be known as someone who backed it to begin with. So that's exposing himself to criticism there. And I think maybe that played into the reason why he actually canceled that speech he was supposed to give, defending the legislation.
Well, I think that if one looks at Prime Minister Netanyahu's record over the years, and he has more of a record than any other prime minister, it's not whether he's committed to this idea, it's when he decides that it's no longer in his benefit to support it. And I think I mean, maybe that's just politics, but I think that's very real. It does appear that the army has been much more aggressive with the Hilltop Youth in the North. At least that's what it sounds like. Is that your understanding as well, that they're taking this more seriously and they're actually going to they're going to respond to the rioters?
I think very marginally so. I think the fact that the government is the composition that it is, where National Security Minister Ben Gvir is in charge of the border police in many ways, who are involved in some of the alleged supposed to be involved in dealing with these attacks, or the police itself, who's supposed to be arresting the perpetrators, and Bezalel Smotrich, who's minister in the defense ministry that has a lot of authority over the West Bank, that is allowing some of these outposts to spring up everywhere, and these outposts have become the hotbeds for these attacks. I think as long as those two are still in power and Netanyahu is not willing to kind of rein them in, I don't see this issue really being dealt with at a serious level. I think there is more talk, and the army itself does seem to be a little bit more interested in dealing with it, but it goes in waves, and it's not like there's been massive arrests made. There's these attacks are happening every day. Just today, there was dozens of suspects who took part in an attack on Palestinians. I think there were 11 people injured, and there weren't any arrests. Now, I think it's a very difficult. The conditions are very difficult because the IDF is in charge of security, so yet they're technically allowed to detain these suspects, but they're supposed to be handing it over to the police. And by the time the police get there, oftentimes the suspects are gone. Or the IDF isn't holding on to the Israelis for very long either. I think the soldiers are in a very difficult position because they're enlisting in order to defend theoretically Israel. Like,
Right.
in their minds, they're not going to. This isn't what they're signing up for, and I think they're also not given the tools to really. They're not a police force, and that's what they're kind of being asked to do in these scenarios. And the police is just ill-equipped and also not invested in dealing with this issue as well. So the government is trying to look at this as an educational problem, and that these are a lot of kids who are dropping out of school and turning to a life of crime. But when they deal with crime in Israel, they don't you do it with kid gloves the way that they are kind of in this
I
situation.
think that's
I think
right.
there's just a lot of political there's politics that enters it that makes it a lot harder to deal with.
I would just say as an American Jewish leader that this is yet another example of just how tone deaf Israelis are to how this impacts world Jewry. This is the ultimate pitchon pev. You open the mouth, you give your detractors all the ammunition they need because there's no way to defend against this. This is just kind of just a moral travesty, and it's very hard
What's
to watch.
interesting is that you've seen also even American Jewish activists start to show up in the West Bank to try to join their Israeli counterparts in trying to protect some of these Palestinian communities that have been victims of attack. And I think actually a week or two ago there was an American Jewish person, a young woman on a gap year program who was actually been, I think, was detained at one of these protests or at one of these clashes and was barred I don't know if they were barred from the West Bank or they actually even have to be deported from Israel. I can't remember the exact details, but
I think she
we
was
reported
barred
a
from the
little bit
West Bank, yeah, but
barred from the West Bank for sure. So it's interesting to see that you're just having American Jews are actually getting actively involved on this issue.
yeah,
That
I
it's
think that's that we're going to see more of that and not less. I want
right.
to just shift over since you are in charge of the American beat.
Hmm.
Um, I take it you went to the GA.
I did not. I've been in the past. I didn't get to go this year. Just it landed on
So
dates that I wasn't. Were you there?
I'm sure you read about Sarah Hurwitz
Yes.
and that entire controversy where she was on the opening panel and she made a statement about I think she was talking about Holocaust education and the focus on Holocaust education, but her sense is that I mean, I don't want to misrepresent her, but I think as I understood it, her sense is that the universal approach to Holocaust education has really harmed Jews in the process. Um, I'm thinking about facing history and the lesson of the Holocaust about nations making choiceless choices of going down this path and not really focusing on the particular Jewish tragedy and pain, as was her point. But she really caught the whirlwind on this by so many in the progressive universe.
Yeah, I think she was making a comment specifically about TikTok and how kids see constantly photos and images, young people of the carnage in Gaza. And then I guess there was a comparison she made toward what the Holocaust as well, and or basically, sorry, these kids are seeing these images and then saying, "Oh, the same thing is happening um,
Right.
in Gaza as what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust," and that's the danger of, I guess, trying to universalize, as you were saying, the Holocaust education, is that you're saying it's just like any other scenario that's happening nowadays, and that this is our current Holocaust. Is that what she was criticizing? And yeah, she got this torrent of. I guess someone picked up that one clip of the her remarks, be it the quote or the footage, and really she was torn apart on online. I guess still amongst this bubble of people, like it's people that live online that feel like this is I'm sure I would not want to be in her shoes to have gone through that. I assume it included death threats. Um,
Yeah.
it's like the space online that people feel comfortable enough to say things that they wouldn't in present and in person. And I think she was just inundated with hate. And I
Right.
think
She's going to
mainly
be,
from like the pro-Palestinian world that simply can't ever accept any sort of coverage or talk about Gaza unless it's framing Israel as just the occupier, genocide perpetrator, and whatnot. And I think that's
right.
what we saw.
She's actually coming to Anshem in a couple of weeks. I don't know if you'll be in town, but maybe you'll come and
Hmm.
hear her. I mean, I'm going to bring this up to her. I want to let her give her the opportunity. I think what was especially noteworthy to me, and just looking at the critics of her statement, were how many Jews got on board on this, Jewish leaders in the progressive universe.
Really.
Um, and, I just want to kind of just move from here to talk about Ben Rhodes' article piece in the New York Times. It was a very lengthy piece on how the Democrats blew it when it came to Bibi. And it's a very damning article, but what I thought was what I wasn't all that surprised knowing having read other things that he's written, but what I think I'm speaking personally, what caught my attention in a very negative way was just how easily he accused Israel of genocide in that piece.
Yeah, I
It's
think
become part of just the common parlance.
correct. Definitely amongst the progressive wing, and I think there's concern amongst Israel that he's going to voices like his will be the guiding light for foreign policy in the Democratic Party, which I don't necessarily think is the case. And it's not for nothing that he was not part of the Biden. Like the Biden administration took a different approach. And yes, we've had the Gaza war since, but I don't think it's a shoe-in that that's going to be what the Democratic Party, the route that they take. But yes, I mean, there's this more populist. I think currently Democrats feel, and I think maybe they're emboldened by Mamdani, but and I've talked a little bit about this even with you, that there is a counter argument to show that it wasn't just um, the more populist anti-Israel agenda that won voters amongst Democrats and Republicans, but also moderates in states like Virginia and elsewhere that Abigail Spansberger, the governor elect there, who argued that actually no, that we need to take a more measured approach, and that did
Yeah.
also win over voters. But right now, yes, I think especially as the war in Gaza is still fresh, I think that sentiment is really it's just so flippantly used. And then if you ask people to kind of maybe explain it a little bit better, maybe they'll fumble or be like, oh, actually things are a little bit more complicated. But I think when running for election specifically, I think you use this very simplified rhetoric. And I just go back to it's not the same thing at all, but I just because we mentioned that when Biden was talking about calling the Saudi crown prince a pariah, and
Right.
that's because that's he felt like that's what you'd need to do and say to win elections. And then when you get in power, you realize that things are a lot more complicated and you take a different approach. So I guess that's the hope is that even if that is the rhetoric that's used, which would, I think, obviously be very unfortunate and dangerous for everyone involved. But once they get in power, they realize that things are more complicated, that everyone has interests that they need to take seriously, and that you can't just let the mob mentality rule the day.
Well, listen, I read that Prime Minister Netanyahu is volunteering to go to New York to speak to Mamdani himself. So I think we can all be assured that they'll catch everything up. Jacob, thank you. You are amazing, and I really appreciate the time that we have and your willingness to take questions. I think all of us are really we derive tremendous benefit from your wisdom, and we're very grateful to you.
Likewise, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Nasiya Tova, safe
Thank
travels.
you.
Look forward to hearing about it when you get back.
Sounds
Bye bye
good.
now.
Bye bye.